Hey everyone, Joe Rips here with another Spire chat. Act 4 for Slay the Spire was released a little over a month ago, I think. Yeah, a little bit over a month ago on the beta branch and is now out on the main branch as well. So this is extra new content for Slay the Spire. Once you've beaten the game at least once with every one of the three classes, you'll get these keys unlock, and you need to get 3 keys and beat the run to unlock Act 4. And you go into Act 4 of that run and have a really difficult elite fight followed by a fight against the super boss of the game. So obviously this video has a bunch of spoilers about Act 4. If you haven't seen that content yet and don't want it spoiled, this is not a very good video to watch. But I've had lots of people ask me about Act 4 and what the best strategies are and how to win on a different class and which one is easiest to win on and all this stuff. And after 200 plus runs, I finally feel ready to actually talk about that. Like, I played 224 runs, is that how math works? And looking at wins, I have 13 on Defect, 20 on Ironclad, and 23 on Silent. And I think that corresponds pretty well to how easy I feel it is to win with the different classes against the Heart. Silent seems to have the easiest time. Ironclad has some pretty good strength and is capable of doing so. And Defect is weird for me. I'm still learning a lot of stuff about Defect and how it scales for Act 4. Maybe I'll get there eventually, but for right now, I think my Defect win rate is not very good. Looks like it's like 1 in 7 or something. So yeah, if you guys want to dig into like all the intricate details and data about the runs, what I'm looking at right now is a report that you can get to by typing !data into my Twitch chat, or I'll link it below this video here on YouTube. And there's all sorts of data here if you want to look through like which encounters are most difficult, which cards are most successful, which cards I take the most often, which choices I make on events. All this sort of information is in this data report, and you can dig through it as much as you like on your own time. I'm not going to be going into every little detail of all that right now. We've got other stuff to talk about. So, beating the Ascension 20 Heart. I'm going to talk about universal things which are true for Ironclad and Silent first, and then I'll be talking about, or Ironclad, Silent, and Defect first, and then I'll be talking specifically about each of the 3 classes and showing you some winning decks and explaining what makes them win and what was important about that run, what the lesson is to take away. So universal lessons about like winning this game at any difficulty really are, number 1, there are limited floors to improve your deck. So even if you're not going to Act 4, you only have 50 floors before you're fighting the Act 3 boss, and you need a deck that's strong enough to beat the Act 3 boss by then. Or you only have, an act and a half before you're having to fight an Act 2 elite that you get forced into, maybe, if the paths don't let you go through Act 2 without fighting an Act 2 elite. So you have to be strong enough to beat an Act 2 elite by then if you want to guarantee that you can win. And the fastest way to improve your deck as you go floor to floor is to be able to beat the floors easily. So to be able to beat a hallway fight without taking a ton of damage means that when you get to a campfire you can upgrade instead of rest. Or to be able to beat an elite fight without dying means that you can choose paths which take you through elite fights and get you more relics and rare cards, which makes you stronger. Elite rooms have 3 times the chance of getting you rare cards compared to hallway fights. Roughly-ish. So, generally speaking, relics and rare cards which you get from elite fights improve your deck by a larger amount than the cards that you're putting into your deck just to be able to beat those elite fights hurt your deck. Early on in the game, a card like Clothesline for Ironclad, or a card like Dagger Spray for Silent, or a card like Ball Lightning for Defect, these cards might not be incredible cards to have for the Act 3 boss fight or for Act 4 when you're fighting the Heart, but because of the value that they get you by letting you beat something like Gremlin Knob or Lagavulin, your getting more out of them by adding them to the deck than you're losing by having to have them in your deck later on in the run. Cards don't always have to build toward a coherent late game strategy. Just seeing that a card that you've been offered helps you beat a fight that you're going to have to prepare for in the near future is enough of a reason to put the card into your deck. You don't need to be like, I'm building an exhaust deck or I'm building a poison deck and this doesn't fit into that strategy. You have to be like, I need to be able to beat Book of Stabbing, and this card makes me able to beat Book of Stabbing. If your deck's strong now, you can make the most of the floors available now to continue getting stronger for later on the game. Another really big point is that a deck is composed of mitigation and damage. So mitigation means surviving the attacks that are being leveled at you, and damage means killing the enemy. And these are two different things, and generally on higher difficulties of the game, you want to be good at doing both of them. So saying that you're building a poison deck as silent, that's incomplete. Poison is a source of damage, but we also have to work out how is our deck going to block. So a deck could deal damage via poison while mitigating via dexterity. You could have copies of footwork and dodge and roll, and footwork and dodge and roll is a nice synergistic package which does a good job of blocking. Where you can get more complicated and work out better things that work even better than that. There's also nothing wrong with having multiple sources and types of damage in a deck and multiple sources and types of mitigation. So you don't need to build a deck which is only poison and only footwork and dodge and rolls. You can have a deck which is lots of poison damage but also has a glass knife in it to be able to nuke down certain enemies who are very dangerous and who need to be killed in the first turn or two. And you can also have like Piercing Whales in your deck. Piercing Whale isn't as good with footwork as dodge and roll is, but it happens to be much better against multi-attack enemies. So now you've got a card in your deck that's good against multi-attacks as well. Successful decks are most easily built by having both mitigation and damage, and they're also best built by having front-loaded and scaling mitigation and damage. So Glass Knife and Noxious Fumes are both dealing lots of damage, but they deal damage in very different ways, and you might think, well, if I'm building a super aggressive deck with aggressive relics, I'd want a Glass Knife, and if I'm building a super defensive deck with defensive stuff, I'd want a Noxious Fumes, because Noxious Fumes deals damage over time, and Glass Knife deals all its damage straight away. And what's more true is that you want to have both types of things in your deck. There are fights where, for example, there are gremlins and they're going to start hitting you for 30 on turn 3 and you want to be able to kill them by then. And for those fights, your deck wants to have a Glass Knife. But there are also fights where you have enemies who have 300 health and you have to be able to kill them over the course of several turns. And in those fights, it's really nice to have a Noxious Fumes. So a deck can have reasons to put both sorts of cards in it, even though they don't seem like they're making a coherent strategy together. It turns out that they are, because a deck wants to be well-rounded and able to deal with lots of different problems. And mitigation works in the same way. So an example of a front-loaded mitigation sort of like Glass Knife is front-loaded damage. Front-loaded mitigation could be max HP. So if you have 120 health, then it's much harder for you to die on turns like 1, 2, and 3, because you can just tank the hits for a bit. And a card like Piercing Whale could also be called front-loaded mitigation. You don't need to set it up. It's actually better the more enemies there are, the more attacks that are coming at you, the more Piercing Whale does. Meanwhile, you can also have scaling mitigation. So something like Bite or Reaper, that gets more and more and more health for you over the course of a fight. Reaper heals you for how much damage it deals, so if you're able to gain strength over the course of a fight, then eventually you have like 30 strength and you play your Reaper, you get a ton of health out of it, but it doesn't do very much on turn 1. Bite, similarly, if you're able to extend a fight for a long time, bites will heal you for a lot. Or there are powers which give you mitigation, like Footwork and Feel No Pain. When you play Footwork, it doesn't block for you at all, but after you've played Footwork, every block card that you play blocks for more. So this is scaling mitigation. And Feel No Pain, similarly, when you play it, it doesn't block at all, but now every time you exhaust a card, it makes block for you for the rest of the fight. Generally speaking, you want to have both sorts of mitigation. So you want to have the front-loaded mitigation that works in turn 1, and the scaling mitigation that gets stronger and stronger as the fight goes on for like boss fights and things like that. And the final big universal point that I want to make is that all you have to do is win the fights. I hear a lot of people like share their runs where something really strong happens. Like I got Dead Branch and Corruption, or I got 3 catalysts and a bunch of poison damage, or something like this. I'm killing everything on turn 2 and giving it 18,000 poison damage. That's cool, that will win you the run, but you don't have to do that to win a run. There are lots of runs where you don't get stuff that's anywhere near that strong, which you can still win, if you're able to put together all the different components of a balanced and strong deck, which is able to play against the weaknesses of different enemies and pilot it well. You don't have to go infinite or hit 999 strength or become invincible for 20 turns. You have to deal 800 damage to the heart while staying alive. That's all the health it has, and it doesn't regenerate health ever. You just have to deal 800. And in the Act 4 Elite fight, the Act 4 Elites don't have that much health really, and probably the scariest moment of that fight is turn 2. If you can survive turn 2, you're probably in pretty good shape. Cards which make a difference to your deck now are almost always more useful than cards which build towards some extremely powerful combo which wasn't even needed to win the run. You don't have to go to 999 block, you don't have to go to 999 strength, you just need to make sure that you survive the next fight, and the one after that, and one after that. So those are like universal things to be thinking about. Build for the moment rather than for the end of the run, but make sure that you're giving yourself the tools to win the end of the run while you do that. Alright, let's look at some Ironclad decks. I made myself a list of 4 runs from each class that I thought were particularly instructive for talking about how the different classes can beat the heart. Ironclad 11-9 at 2:13 a.m. Where'd you go? Okay, so something that's, I think, very interesting to newer players of the game when playing Ironclad is seeing what happens when someone who's played Ironclad for a long time plays an Ironclad run with Corruption and Exhaust synergies. Because Exhaust synergies are the strongest thing that Ironclad has going for it, really. They're very accessible. Corruption, one of the strongest cards in the game, makes all your skills cost 0, which breaks the energy requirements of the game. Now you can play all of your cards for free, energy-wise at least. And whenever you play a skill Exhaust it, now all of a sudden you're triggering all of your Exhaust energies every time you play a skill. This card's an uncommon. You'll see this in a lot of runs. And then there are a lot of cards that combine with it to just be very, very, very powerful. Juggernaut makes it so all these skills which you're playing for 0 energy, well, if they're block cards, now they're dealing 7 damage to something as well. That's a lot of damage. Dark Embrace makes it so they all draw you a card, so you're just going crazy this turn. Feel No Pain makes it so when they get exhausted, they gain 4 block for you. And this doubles up Juggernaut, so if I have Feel No Pain, Corruption, and Juggernaut in play, when I play a Defend, the Defend gave me 5 block, the Feel No Pain gave me 4 block, I got blocked 2 different times, and Juggernaut's dealing 14 damage to something. I have Dark Embrace in play, I also draw a card. So this quickly snowballs into an extremely, extremely strong value engine. And this was the most ridiculous of the Exhaust synergy decks that I saw that didn't have a Dead Branch in it. Dead Branch plus Corruption. Dead Branch makes it so every time you exhaust a card, you get a new card in your hand. So every time you exhaust your skill, you get a new card, and often it's another skill, and you play it and exhaust it. This is one of the most powerful combinations in the game. But I wanted to show you how ridiculously strong a deck with Corruption without Dead Branch can be. And I thought that this was a very good example of it. There are a couple of other things I want to point out in this deck. I do have a Jax Plus here to gain myself some strength, and a Reaper. Often decks which are based around Exhaust synergies take a while to come together. Corruption's not an incredible card to put into your deck until usually like halfway through the run is where it starts to be very, very good. You can put it in your deck earlier, but usually it's not actually that great yet. And then, like, this deck has 4 copies of Feel No Pain, but we didn't have 4 copies of Feel No Pain straight away. So this deck just like has 1 spot weakness, it has 1 Jax Plus, it has a Reaper, it has a Pummel, it has ways to deal damage which worked and made sense in the first half of the run, which built toward this ridiculous exhaust deck. And the nature of this exhaust deck is that its strength is coming from, 1, powers, and 2, having tons and tons of skills to play once the powers are all in play. So it's not hurt very much at all from having cards dedicated to dealing damage or blocking in the early game before the exhaust synergies all turn on. As you're playing through a fight, we ended the run with 101 health. So for the first like 3 or 4 turns, it's fine to just be playing our powers as we draw them and, you know, take some damage if our synergies aren't turned on yet and we're going to take some damage. That's completely fine. So yeah, this is obviously a very, very, very strong deck, and I think like having half this much exhaust synergy stuff is going to be strong enough to beat the heart usually. Like we have 2 copies of corruption so that we can draw corruption faster, because it means that we turn our stuff on turn like 2 on average instead of turn 4 on average or something. But having 1 would have been enough. We have 4 Feel No Pains, probably having 2 would have been enough. Having probably 1 of Dark Embrace or Juggernaut would have been enough. But this is a very, very strong example of an exhaust synergy deck. Alright, I want to look at a Barricade plus Entrench deck. This is another very strong thing that Ironclad can do. I don't think that this is anywhere near as easy to put together, because this relies on Barricade, which is a rare card, and it's a rare card which is pretty hard to justify taking early on in the run, because this doesn't do anything unless you make more block than you're being attacked for. And if you can do that in Act 2, like, that's wonderful. Congratulations. If you can consistently do that in Act 2 on Ascension 20, that's a lovely world to be in. But realistically, Ironclad does not spend a lot of time making more block than it's being attacked for in Act 2. So Barricade is a card that doesn't get really exciting until you're like preparing for the Act 2 boss or going into Act 3 already. And it's a rare, so it's hard to see it at that time. And then the combo here is Entrench to double our block. So Barricade makes it so we keep our block forever, and Entrench makes it so that the more block we're keeping, the more block we can have. And this deck happens to have 2 of those. And Entrench isn't a very good card without Barricade. And it's not a very good card early in the run either. So, generally speaking, I think that this sort of mitigation is harder to put together just because it's hard to take the cards at times where it makes sense. But if you do put this mitigation together, it's very capable of beating the heart. And so this deck doesn't actually do that much stuff that's really strong other than have a Barricade and 2 copies of Entrench. Like it really, really doesn't. We've got a couple of copies of Feel No Pain, again, but I don't have that much exhaust going on in the deck. I don't have a copy of Corruption, so I can't make all of my skills exhaust. I just have 2 copies of True Grit plus, basically, to get a little bit of exhaust going, and 2 Warcries. For the most part, I have this Barricade I can get into play, I have 2 copies of Entrench, and I have 1 Headbutt to put an Entrench back on top to play it again. You can see all sorts of other stuff going on in this deck, which wasn't quite as important against the heart, but which was very important for getting the run to a point where it was allowed to fight the heart at all. So this deck has 2 copies of Combust. This card just deals truckloads of damage in fights which are difficult for a deck to survive. Reptimencer in Act 3 or the 3 Slavers in Act 2 are examples of elite fights where Combust is very, very, very good and is the sort of card which can get you through those fights where other cards just wouldn't be able to do that. There's like cards like Power Through Plus, which really doesn't have much in the way of synergies here. I'm not doing anything great with the wounds or anything. It's just a card that makes me a lot of block because I have to stay alive. Our relics are not particularly super strong. We do have a Feed Plus, which is excellent in any Barricade deck because you're able to stall toward the end of the fight, so we're able to end the run at 122 HP, which helps keep us alive a lot. We have a Limit Break, which I don't think did much of anything in this run. Like there's an Inflame too for 3 strength in the Limit Break. But in general, I don't find that Ironclad has much ability to win with only Limit Break stuff at Ascension 20 for two reasons. One, the heart's damage taken is capped at 200 per turn, so going to like 60 strength doesn't matter. You don't need to make that much strength. And two, the strength scaling stuff doesn't really offer you any ability to block. It's stuff that takes a lot of space in your deck and doesn't block very well with it unless you get specifically Reaper, in which case you have like scaling mitigation, but you're still taking a lot of damage early in fights and still very able to die in that way. So I haven't found strength to be all that strong for Ironclad. Alright, I'm getting very long-winded here, aren't I? I'm gonna throw you a list that might make your brain hurt a little bit. I called this a cobbled together hybrid in my description of it in my notes. If you look at these 22 cards, there is not much going on here that looks like it adds up to a super strong deck. We have a Corruption and a Feel No Pain, but there are actually only like 9 skills total in the entire deck. So that doesn't really do that much. We've got a couple of spot weaknesses and a limit break, so we can make some strength and a Reaper to heal when we do that. We've got a Fiendfire Plus. Fiendfire Plus deals a bunch of damage, especially with Runic Pyramid. At the end of your turn, you no longer discard your hand, so you can get a full hand and then Fiendfire and exhaust all 9 cards in your hand for tons of damage. This is an example of a deck where we're like blending together strong things in Ironclad. It's, I think, a very good example of how restrictive it is to think about like I'm making a strength deck or I'm making an exhaust deck, because this deck, it has strength to give it scaling damage. The fact that it has Reaper plus strength gives it some amount of scaling mitigation. The fact that it has Corruption and Feel No Pain plus gives it a little bit more scaling mitigation, and added together that gives you just barely enough mitigation to get through fights. It's got a Fiendfire plus for front-loaded damage and a Whirlwind plus for front-loaded damage. It's got a Runic Pyramid, so we're able to deploy our cards in the best possible turns for them. We can do things like make sure that we're always using this headbutt to get limit break back on top by not playing the headbutt until we've played the limit break. And this check just does like just barely strong enough things with cards that don't really synergize all that great together, but which nonetheless can sum up to enough to win in a Ascension 20 heart fight. I want to show you this taken sort of to the extreme, in my opinion. This run, I think, like, actually doesn't have anything strong going on. It doesn't have particularly many relics. It doesn't have a copy of Corruption or Feel No Pain in it. It has 2 copies of Body Slam, but there's no like Entrench, and the only way we have to keep block is Calipers, which is great if we're able to make a ton of block, but it's sort of difficult for us to. Looking at this run, it might be difficult to even work out how this deck could beat the Act 4 heart fight, and part of it is that we have Potion Belt, so we had 2 more potions for the heart fight, and just getting the right potions can do an awful lot for you. I had 2 speed potions for the heart fight, which they give you 5 dexterity for 1 turn, and I was just able to use those on the right turns to be very strong. Another thing is that we have a Disarm Plus, which reduces the heart strength by 3. The heart has an attack where it attacks you for its strength times 15, so reducing that by 3 is reducing your incoming damage by 45. This is a very strong card just for that particular fight, and for many other fights. Disarm is just a solid card. And we've got an Exhume Plus to get it back again as well. We have a Feed in the deck, which meant that we were able to go into the boss fight with 103 health. We have a Runic Pyramid, which meant we were able to deploy our cards on the right turns again. I think that Runic Pyramid is one of the strongest boss relics in the game. I regularly take it over an Energy Relic. We even have a Philosopher's Stone, which gives that heart times 15 attack 1 more strength. But again, we've got a Disarm, so we were able to counteract that no problem. We've got some Shrugs to block with, and we actually have a Kunai, which is actually pretty relevant with Pyramid. We're able to hold on to attacks to play 3 of them on turns where it's easy to play 3 attacks and get dexterity to go later into the fight. And yeah, this deck ended up being able to jam a bunch of block into play using one of those speed potions and the kunai to gain dexterity, and a bunch of shrugs, and then it has 2 body slams, and it had a true grit to exhaust some cards and a fiend fire to exhaust some cards, so it could exhaust down to a deck that was largely body slams and shrugs and beat the heart. And I think this was probably the most fun deck out of the 4 that I've shown you to play, because it's just using pretty mediocre tools. It has an immolate to beat hallway fights, which is certainly not very good for the heart fight, and putting them together in a way that successfully maneuvers through the fight and wins. There's a lot of room in this game to do stuff like this. Okay, let's talk about some silent runs next. The silent is the class that I've had the most success on, and this is actually the first of the silent runs that I wanted to show you. The purpose of showing you this is just to take note of how ridiculously strong Intangible is as a mechanic, as damage mitigation. So Wraithform Plus gives you 3 stacks of Intangible, which makes it so that all damage taken and HP loss is reduced to 1 while you're intangible. For 3 turns, you're basically invincible. This deck also has 3 copies of Apparition Plus. There's an event in Act 2, which gives you 3 of these for half of your health. At lower difficulties, it actually gives you 5 of them, which is ridiculous, but at high difficulties, it gives you 3, which is still something you consider taking fairly often. And it had a Toxic Egg, so when I took those skills, they were automatically upgraded. Without upgrades, Apparition will exhaust itself from your hand if you don't play it, but with the upgrade, you can hold on to it for as long as you want and then play it on the turn where you want it. This deck, again, has Runic Pyramid, so it's very able to deploy the Apparitions when it wants to. It has a copy of Burst Plus, so it can play the Apparitions twice, which means that if you do the math, here's 3 turns of Invincible, each of the Apparitions twice gives another 6 turns of Invincible, so we're invincible for 9 turns against the heart with this deck. At which point, we only have to deal 800 damage, so it's just a question of, do we have like anything in this deck that deals any damage at all? And the answer is like, yeah, we got like a Noxious Fumes Plus, makes some poison. The Caltrops Plus, the heart attacks you times 15, so 15 times 5 that's 75 every 3 turns. You know, we just got a little bit of damage, and that's enough to kill the heart. When you look at a silent deck like this, going invincible for like 3+ turns in hallway fights or elite fights for pretty much the entire game is going to win you the fight with almost any damage source. I don't think Intangible is a very healthy thing to have in the game, really. A lot of these runs, it feels like most of the decisions that are getting made don't matter because you're just invincible and don't have to think about blocking, and also don't really have to think about dealing damage because Silent just has plenty of ways to deal damage, and if you have all of your energy available every turn to deal damage because you don't really have to worry about blocking, you can just do whatever you want. I do want to make a call out to Crippling Cloud Plus, though, which is an incredible front-loaded silent card. I think it's an easy card to overlook, maybe, but so many of Silent's poison cards, poison-centric damage cards, are very slow and take a long time to ramp up, and also don't really influence enemies when you play them. And Crippling Cloud giving 7 AoE poison is a huge deal in a lot of the Act 2 fights, particularly the Act 2 Elite fights, and weakening for 2 to all enemies is also a really big deal. It's the only AoE weak that Silent has available to it. So, very, very good card. Piercing Wail Plus, another very good card. This is essentially going invincible for 1 more turn against the Heart, because the Heart has a times 15 attack, and when it's like 4 times 15, your Piercing Wail, now it's 0 times 15, and this common just blocked for 60 damage for 1 energy. Piercing Wail is a ridiculously powerful card against the Heart. This deck has a Shuriken as well, which we were able to proc sometimes because we have Runic Pyramid, but not much at all because it has almost no attacks in it. Yeah. Fun deck. Another example of the same sort of concept. This one looks a little bit less broken maybe, but pretty much exactly the same things going on. We've got 2 copies of Wraithform Plus in this one, plus 3 apparitions, gives us 9 turns of invincibility. And then there are just like a couple of Noxious Fumes, a Catalyst Plus, a Bouncing Flask Plus. Catalyst Plus, I think, is one of the more hyped up, more needlessly hyped up silent cards. This is a card which can help get your poison up to an impressive level, but it doesn't do much on turn 1 because you haven't applied poison to the enemy yet. And poison scaling damage is so strong even without Catalyst that you don't really need this for most fights. Places that Catalyst is very strong are against Champ and Time Eater, where you can use it to... both of those fights, they have like a phase shift when they get below half health, where they get more dangerous, and this lets you just kill them from above half health by timing it properly. But yeah, like, this is a somewhat comparable run. We have stronger relics in this run. We have Runic Pyramid again. Runic Pyramid's very, very, very strong. Took a Ritual Dagger in this one because of the Runic Pyramid, making it very easy to deploy it at the right times. Mummified Hand early on in the run means that taking an energy relic from the Act 1 boss is not anywhere near as important, because Mummified Hand just makes you so much energy over the course of a fight. Silent has pretty significant access to intangible mitigation, so a lot of runs look much like that, but I wanted to give you an example of a run which doesn't have intangible and is mitigating in different ways. This one also doesn't have Runic Pyramid, but instead we have Well-Laid Plans, which lets us retain our most important card for the turn where we need it. And rather than having intangible, this deck has 2 copies of Piercing Wail for the multi-attack turns, 1 Malaise also hits the multi-attack turns very heavily, and then we've got an Incense Burner to go intangible. I guess we do have intangible. We go intangible every 6 turns. If you stack this to 3 or 4 charges, it will go off during the most threatening heart attacks. The heart attacks where you're vulnerable and frail on turns 2 and 3 of that fight. And we just have like footworks and dodge and rolls. Dodge and rolls great with footwork because it makes you block twice, which means that the dexterity from footwork applies more than 1 time. There really isn't anything else this deck. It deals damage with Noxious Fumes, Bouncing Flask, and Catalyst Plus. Deadly Poison applies some poison as well. And that's basically what's going on here. It's a deck that's pretty weak in AoE fights, but it's able to get by with Mercury Hourglass, dealing 3 damage to all enemies, Letter Opener, dealing 5 damage to all enemies, and just having a truckload of relics, really. This deck got a very large number of relics from fighting a lot of elites early. You can see elite on floor 6, 8, 10, and 13. And Silent's quite capable of killing elites. We got a Noxious Fumes, Dagger Throw, Bag of Preparation, and Weak Potion, upgraded our Noxious Fumes, got a Strength Potion, and then it was just fights the rest of the way through the act, with the relics that we picked up from the fights being strong enough to keep us going. A lot of people ask me about Shiv decks against the Heart, and whether it's possible to like play Shivs and how they should build Shivs. And going back to the Universal's points, like Shivs are just a way to deal damage. They just attack. Like they're not blocking for you. So making a Shiv deck isn't enough. You have to make a deck which deals damage with Shivs plus blocks. And I thought this was a pretty good example of that sort of deck. So we've got like a Glass Knife Plus for some front-load damage, and 3 copies of Cloak and Dagger Plus, makes some Shivs, then we've got 1,000 Cuts Plus, so we're dealing AoE damage whenever we play these Shivs, and After Image Plus, we're gaining block whenever we play these Shivs. This deck even has a Terror Plus in it to vulnerable for that attack damage, and a Panache Plus in it for like extra AoE as we play lots of stuff. There's no like super strong Shuriken or Kunai in the deck to scale up the Shivs though. And like the answer to how this deck beats the Heart and if you're the sort of person who really wants to like construct a deck that's only about shivs, maybe this will like make you really upset or something. I don't know, and I apologize if that's the case, but this deck's capable of blocking using 2 copies of Footwork and like leg sweeps and cloak and daggers, backflips, just good block cards. And then like and it has 2 piercing whales as well. 2 piercing whales, super strong here. And then I just like added 2 deadly poisons to it because these deal a truckload of damage over time. There are 2 deadly poisons and a corpse explosion plus. I added one of the deadly poisons to it on floor 46. You might not think of deadly poison as the sort of card you're really hoping and dreaming of having on floor 46, but hey, it like deals 7 damage every turn for the rest of the fight after you cast it, and that's pretty cool. So I've had a heart kill with Silent. I'm not sure which run it was, but I've had a heart kill with Silent where I got a deadly poison super late in the run, and I had a nightmare, and the idea of the nightmare was like I was going to nightmare malaise or something, and then malaise the heart over and over again, but I ended up in the fight just nightmaring the deadly poison, just having 4 deadly poison pluses in my deck and just playing them. That just deals lots of damage. So yeah, we've got shivs in this deck for AoE, and 1,000 cuts plus corpse explosion plus panache gives this deck tons of AoE and a lot of ability to deal with holy fights, but like when it comes down to it, Silent has cards at common which apply poison, and poison deals truckloads of damage, and if you have to deal 800 damage to one enemy who never cleanses poison, there's just very little reason not to take this common card, which is available to Silent. Don't get stuck in the idea that you have to build like a themed deck and you're building a themed deck out of a card pool. What's really happening is you're building a deck out of a card pool, and if some of the cards in that card pool are particularly strong for a particular fight, you're going to be happy to have them in basically every run. There's no reason that on any run they'd suddenly be bad at that fight, most likely. Alright, so looking at defects being the toughest for me, I want to give you a few different examples of ways that I've won runs. I'm trying not to show you necessarily the most broken of the decks I've played. I'm trying to show you like interesting different approaches to it. Sort of necessarily the decks which beat the heart are going to be pretty strong, but I'm going to try to show you different ways to do it. The most complicated thing for Defect in beating the heart is that Defect's ability to create scaling damage is quite limited. Most of the orb mechanic sort of stuff for Defect creates damage like a drop of water coming out of a tap or something. So it like builds up damage and then it drops it all at once, and then for most fights in the game that's enough to win. An example would be making a dark orb and then letting it charge up and then evoking it, or playing electrodynamics and then evoking the lightning orbs that electrodynamics made makes a bunch of AoE damage straight away. But there aren't that many Defect strategies for making damage which scales even past that. And against the heart, you can only deal 200 damage a turn. So even if you make the most gargantuan dark orb and then multicast it, you're still only dealing 200 of the 800 damage you have to deal in a turn. So, Defect has lots of ways to mitigate incoming damage. That's not too big a deal. In this deck, the way that we're mitigating is mostly we're making frost orbs with Cold Snap and Cool Headed, and we're giving them focus with our copies of Defragment, and we have an Echo form so we can play the Defragments twice. And then this deck in particular ends up killing by going sort of pseudo-infinite. It doesn't necessarily actually set up an infinite, but it has Ice Cream to conserve energy between turns, and it has 2 copies of Meteor Strike, which costs 5 energy to channel 3 plasma, and when you evoke 3 plasma you get 6 energy. It also has a copy of Recycle Plus to exhaust the card and gain energy equal to its cost. So this deck was super fun to play. There was lots of like lining up 3 different types of orbs for compile driver to draw 3 cards, drawing cards with cool-headed plus, and then recycling tons and tons of cards over and over again, drawing recycle over and over again with our 3 copies of hologram plus, and getting to a point where we were like playing Meteor Strike and evoking it with lots of different orbs, and ending up killing by like evoking a couple of lightning orbs over and over again with Sap plus, making them over and over again, and stuff like that. This is one of the things you can do with Defect, which is pretty cool and fun to do, and can be strong enough to beat the heart, despite the fact that the heart is dealing you 2 damage every time you play a card. Like in this deck we have Ornamental Fan, so every 3 attacks we gain 4 block, and that helps a bit with like making sure that Compile Driver doesn't kill us when it's dealing us 2 damage every time we play a card. Another Defect deck I had that this one actually like scaled in a way where it made that drop of water, and it made the drop of water so large that it could just go off 4 times in a row and kill the heart. So this deck is based very heavily around scaling with orbs. And orbs and the focus mechanic for Defect give you the possibility of scaling to a point where you can beat the heart, but you have to commit pretty hard to it. We have 2 copies of Genetic Algorithm in this deck. Genetic Algorithm is an excellent way to create enough block to stay alive. It's a front-loaded mitigation card, which takes a while to scale up over the course of a run. It's a card that I take as late as like halfway through Act 3 on Defect pretty regularly, just because of how powerful it is against the heart and against the Act 4 elites. And in this deck, we try to get Biased Cognition off with an artifact charge to prevent us from getting the Defect where we're losing 1 focus, so that gains us 5 focus without us losing out. I think in the final fight we actually played it without doing that, because like just getting 5 focus, then 4 focus, then 3 focus, then 2 focus, and then by then you have 1. That's fine. Biased Cognition's a very, very strong card. So it's got that, it's got a Capacitor Plus. It has a Consume to get a little bit more focus, and it has Darkness Plus and Defragment Plus. And this is the way that it won. It used Darkness Plus to make like 4 Dark Orbs, I think, using Hologram to get it back, and Rebound to play it multiple times. And then it got those Dark Orbs to a point where they were strong enough to like deal 200 damage to the heart each, just about. Used Recursion. Recursion with Dark Orbs will rechannel the Dark Orb with the same amount of damage on it. So if you have a 150 damage Dark Orb at the front of your orbs and you play Recursion, you'll deal 150 damage with that Dark Orb and then make a 150 Dark Orb at the back of your orbs. The Recursion has some strength with Dark Orbs, although it's a little bit of an awkward card to use. And yeah, that was strong enough to beat the heart this time around. We've got a little bit of mitigation with stuff like Fossilized Helix and Thread and Needle and just bits and pieces here and there in our relics. And we also had a Symbiotic Virus to channel 1 Dark at the beginning of combat to get us started. This deck has 3 copies of Sweeping Beam in it, 2 of them upgraded. You do have to beat the fights leading up to the heart, and Defect, if you don't get Electrodynamics, struggles a lot with AoE damage, so Sweeping Beam can help round out your deck in that way. The deck also had a Shuriken, so we were trying to attack spam for a little while. Like there's 2 copies of Compile Driver as well, and a Ball Lightning Plus. And that was an identity that the deck had for a little bit, until the Darkness damage engine took over for it. This is a deck which has a pretty similar idea, but ends up being even better at it. I'm not sure that I'm going to talk about this deck for like super long because it's doing very similar things, but again, we've got 2 copies of Darkness this time, 3 copies of Hologram Plus, so we're just very able to make tons and tons of Darkness Orbs and kill the heart that way. This is another deck with Runic Pyramid. I have so many runs with Runic Pyramid in them, which have won. It's such a good relic. And then this run I wanted to show off. Several of my wins, especially recently, have been around just using Blizzard for all of my damage, basically. Defect has Blizzard, deal damage equal to 2 times the number of Frost Channel this combat to all enemies, or 3 times if it's upgraded. And it has Thunder Strike, which does a comparable thing with Lightning Orbs. And those are 2 ways that Defect does have scaling that keeps on just going up and up and up and up as the fight goes on. And it turns out that making Frost Orbs and just spending all of your resources making Frost Orbs is actually a pretty reasonable way to stay alive long enough for those blizzards to deal a bunch of damage. So this deck has 3 copies of Echo Form. I think it might be the only Snecko deck that I've shown you. And it's not because Snecko isn't strong or anything, it's one of the strongest relics. I think it's because a lot of my Snecko decks are so strong that I didn't bother bringing them up. Especially like Ironclad Snecko Corruption decks. But Snecko is incredible because it lets you draw 2 cards every turn, which means that you get to the important cards in your deck faster and faster and faster. And also because like some of the really important cards like cost 3 usually, like Echo Form. And with Snecko Echo Form instead gets randomized between 0 and 3 cost, which means that we're playing the Echo Forms considerably less mana on average. Less energy, sorry. Recycle is an excellent card with Snecko in order to recycle like your strike that costs 3 this turn. All of a sudden you have a bunch more energy to play other stuff with. And another thing that Recycle does is it exhausts your deck down to ward the cards that matter. So this deck is able to like play all of its Echo Forms and its Capacitors and its 1 Defragment Plus. I've had success with Frost Orb decks with Defect which didn't have any focus at all, just to give you an idea of how strong the strategy can be. You don't even really need this Defragment Plus. And once you get rid of the powers, which like are removed from your deck when you play them, they're in play forever, you never have to draw them again. And once you've recycled like a couple of defends or something like that, you get to a point where this deck is just drawing tons of copies of Glacier and tons of copies of Cool-Headed Plus and just making tons and tons of Frost Orbs. Like, it's not that unusual for this deck to make 6+ Frost Orbs in one turn. And that means that Blizzard Plus scales up very quickly. There are 3 copies of Blizzard in the deck, so once it's getting any sort of considerable damage on it, you're able to draw it just over and over again, play it, and get kills. I think this is one of the simplest ways that Defect has to win against the Heart. You don't have to think very much at all to have this work, and you actually can pull it off pretty consistently in my experience. The one thing I will say about this sort of deck is that it's very bad at front-loading damage. This deck does not have much in the way of front-loading damage at all. This particular copy of it is so strong that that didn't matter. The combination of Snecko plus Gambling Chip especially, so we can look at our starting hand of 7 cards thanks to Snecko and then discard the ones that cost a lot and aren't useful and get a bunch of other cards in our starting hand too. We can potentially dig 14 cards into our deck on turn 1, which is like halfway through the deck. This deck was just able to like start blocking for 80 on turn 2 pretty regularly, and it didn't matter very much that we didn't have a ton of front-loader damage. But I want to point out that we do have a little bit of it. We've got a Doom and Gloom. Doom and Gloom just deals some AoE, channels a Dark Orb. It deals good damage quickly in a couple of different ways. We have a Darkness. For a while, this deck looked like it might be a deck that was trying to kill with Darkness Orbs before we started picking up enough Frost Orbs and Blizzards to kill with Blizzards. And in general, I think Defect is pretty happy to like build a deck like this, but have a copy of Electrodynamics in it so that it has AoE damage for hallway fights. Or like you saw earlier, like throw some copies of Sweeping Beam or Compile Driver in and maybe a Shuriken, and all of a sudden you have attacks which can kill the easier fights for you. Because a lot of these decks are not going to have enough block to block against something like Reptimancer. For example, turn 2 against Reptimancer, you're just going to die unless you've dealt with the summons. Keeping in mind that you can have potions to help you for that sort of stuff can really help too, like holding onto an exploding potion or something like that. Alright. Well, I hope you enjoyed hanging out and looking at Ascension 20 decks for 50 minutes. This was a terrible way to make this from like a search engine optimization point of view. or even maybe from a consumption point of view. Maybe I should have made 4 independent videos for this, but I didn't. It was a fun way for me to do it. Hopefully, I mean, all the information's here, right? You want to hang out and watch these runs live? I stream Slay the Spire pretty much every day over on twitch.tv/JoeOnRibs. That's linked below this video. If you have any questions about the stuff I've talked about, I'm happy to answer them. Again, if you want to take a look at all of the data from all of these runs, that's linked below the video and can also be accessed by just typing !data into my Twitch chat whenever you'd like. I'm JoeOnRibs. I've been playing Slay the Spire for a long time. I have more than 2,000 hours in this game at this point. I have had lots of world record streaks at the game. I think that my 4-0 streaks on Ascension 20 killing the heart are the longest ones that anybody's streamed, but I don't know. It's hard to keep track of it all. So yeah. I hope you enjoyed the chat, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.